Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to our Coexistence in Practice webinar series hosted by the Coexistence Consortium. Before we start today's talk, I would like to give you a brief intro about us and the structure of this webinar. We are a network of conservation researchers and practitioners from diverse disciplines united by a common vision, which is to understand the intricate dynamics of coexistence between humans and wildlife. Our mission extends beyond the conservation of wild animals confined to distant forest pockets. We emphasize the importance of living well with nature, even in our immediate surroundings. Our collective long-term vision is to employ an experimental and evidence-based approach to catalyze a variety of human-wildlife coexistence projects worldwide. So, a little bit about the structure of this webinar. Um, our speaker will be presenting for about 40 to 45 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A for 15 to 20 minutes. I'll now invite Seema, who is a member of the consortium, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, Varun. So I'm introducing Aditya on behalf of Nitin Shekhar, who is a really close friend of Aditya and who has requested Aditya to give a talk for all of us. And I'm going to read a long intro because Nitin has put in a lot of effort to write a really brilliant intro for Aditya. So hold on to the horses. So he says, hello, everyone. I'm delighted to have been asked to introduce Aditya for this talk to the Coexistence Consortium. Aditya S.K. has been serving as the Asian Outreach Coordinator for Animal Ethics since 2018. Aditya started out as an engineer, like most of us, doing his Bachelor in Technology in Computer Science at JNTU, Hyderabad, but he quickly switched tracks to follow his passion in animal welfare. He has a postgraduate in animal protection law and from the National Academy of Legal Studies and Research. Additionally, Aditya has worked with various animal advocacy organizations to promote moral consideration for animals in India and far-flung places like Lithuania and the UK. He's soon to start his PhD in the animal ethics with Oscar Hotra at USC in Spain. Now he comes to, I asked the Coexistence Consortium to Aditya to speak today because I believe this interest lies to addressing a crucial gap in the Coexistence Consortium focus area and actually in conservation at large. The Coexistence Consortium has been developed to help address what I see as one of the two original scenes of the modern Western conservation. That modern Western conservation has been built around the interest of elites and their interest, so often at the expense of the local people. Given that communities cohabit with wildlife, have such a rich understanding of the non-human neighbors, we all lost out through this top-down model of conservation. But I believe the consortium should pay more attention to the second sin of the modern Western conservation that is so often conducted to serve the interest of humans at the expense of animals themselves. Most of us get into conservation because we love animals, but we are not trained in science of understanding what serves the interest of individual animals or taught to think about the ethical implications of how we treat animals, either in our personal or professional lives. My hope is that Aditya becomes part of the consortium community and he helps us think more about how we can reduce unnecessary animal suffering, and then he gets to learn from the rest of you about the many ways in which communities' interest must be considered in conservation. I have only had a few meetings with Aditya, but have found him kind, thoughtful, and exceeding gracious in discussions. I'm sorry to be missing out this presentation, but I'm so excited to be introducing him to all of you, and I look forward to the recording. Nitin Shekhar. Thank you, Aditya. Over to you.
Wow, that was an extremely kind introduction. Thank you so much, Seema. And if you're seeing this, thank you, Nitin. Yeah, that was very heartfelt and makes me feel really happy. And thanks everyone for inviting me for this talk and for being here. It's an honor to be presenting this topic to all of you. I've watched some of the recordings from the previous discussions, and I was very inspired with all the wealth of knowledge that's there in this consortium. And so, yeah, it's very exciting for me to present this topic that I have been talking about for the past few years to all of you, and to engage with your thoughts, your inputs, and your reflections on on this topic, which is reimagining conservation and why wild animal welfare matters. And as Nitin put in his eloquent introduction, I think this is a very, very important topic and is quite neglected in most discussions. And I think this group in particular would be very important for me to share this information with, because I think you have more on-the-ground understanding of the realities in India and elsewhere as well. And so I would love to engage. And as Seema mentioned, I am the Asia Outreach Coordinator for Animal Ethics. I give talks on different topics related to animal ethics, among which the primary one is wild animal welfare / suffering. And I also talk about other issues like speciesism, as well as the importance of considering long-term future when designing animal advocacy strategies. That said, I will get into the talk. I want to caveat, I don't have a background in conservation or ecology like most of you might have. My background is in advocacy. I'm an ethicist and working on wild animal welfare. So I think it would be very I want to caveat that. Given that conservation is a very complex, multifaceted issue, I would like to shine light on these facets that I have more information about. And I would like to invite you to help me disentangle how this will interact with the other domains of knowledge that you might have. That said, I will move on. Also, this is like a lot of dense information, so I'll probably go a little fast. If there's any questions, I'm happy to elaborate on that later in the talk. So regarding the structure of the talk, I wanted to start off with giving some, okay, I need to share my screen. Wait, is my screen visible?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I would like to start off with talking a little bit about this prejudice called as speciesism and how that relates to the remainder of the talk. I will also talk about sentience and why that matters. And then I will go on to talk about the situation of animals, both that are farmed and exploited by humans, as well as those that are free living. And then I will talk about how is this context relevant to India, and what are some action steps or some lines of research that we as people who care about human wild animal interaction can pursue to make change or advance this space of wild animal welfare. To start off with, what is speciesism? I'm sure a lot of you are aware about the different forms of discriminations and prejudices like racism, sexism, casteism, classism, which are very complex forms of prejudices that are displayed by humans towards other humans, where we discriminate against individuals based on unjustified, arbitrary factors. Where there's two individuals who have interests, the discrimination implies like considering the interests of some individuals over the others for arbitrary reasons like skin color, gender, their caste or class, whereas we recognize those are irrelevant factors. And what matters is that they have interests and that they need to be respected. Similarly, speciesism is a similar prejudice where one discriminates against individuals based on the species that they're born into. There are different forms of speciesism, of course. The dominant form of speciesism is called as anthropocentrism. I'm sure most of you must be aware of this worldview where there is this belief that the interests of humans counts for much more than equally strong interests of animals. There are many examples of this. Say, for example, with culinary pleasure, for 5 minutes of culinary pleasure, a non-human animal goes through a lifetime of confinement and harm. And in this case, the interests are not even equal. It's much stronger interests of animals with very low pleasure of humans. Similarly, for vanity, like cosmetics or other like clothing, where for just trivial pleasure pursuits, we put animals to tremendous amount of harm and we disregard their interests. So yeah, this is one most prevalent form of speciesism that we see in our society. But of course, there's also other forms of speciesism. One, it could be for aesthetic reasons, where animals that are more cute or more quote unquote magnificent, more beautiful, are given more consideration, are treated with more care as compared to animals that are not aesthetic or are considered ugly. Say, for example, pandas are given a lot of consideration, whereas like wild boars or animals that are viewed as dirty are not cared for. While both of them have interests, there's this arbitrary discrimination that occurs. Similarly, for scientific purposes, like there are animals that are considered valuable for conservationist reasons, say keystone species, whereas there are other animals that are considered as vermin or pests, or they're not that useful, say, for example, like crows or other animals, which are not cared for, whereas for the animals that are considered scientifically valuable, there's a lot of protection for these animals. There's a lot of investment that goes into like creating sanctuaries or rehabilitation centers for these animals, whereas other animals are usually neglected. Similarly, based on size, the larger animals on average tend to get more consideration compared to the smaller animals. One could argue that maybe this is because the larger animals are more expressive, it's more easier for humans to relate with them, and hence it's easier for us to empathize and care for them. But whereas with the smaller animals, say invertebrates or insects, it's harder to grasp their expressions. But again, size is an arbitrary factor when deciding how to grant more consideration to beings. Now, usually when I talk about this to people, there's presented to defend speciesism. But now I will present some broad forms of arguments that are very common to defend anthropocentrism. The first one is that humans have this complex intellectual capacities. We are more cognitively sophisticated, and hence we should only care about humans. The second argument that's presented is that we have a special relationship with humans. We're part of the same community, and we have solidarity and sympathy with each other, whereas animals are not part of this special relationship that we share with humans, and hence can be disregarded. And the third one is the argument from might, which is that humans are more dominant, we are more powerful, and hence it's okay to disregard the interests of the weaker beings. Now, let's look at if these arguments hold up under scrutiny. There's a variety of arguments that one could use to rebut some of these claims that are made, but I will present one such argument, which is called as the argument from species overlap. So the belief is that there is this one line that separates human animals from non-human animals, where humans possess this fundamental qualities about them, which is cognitive sophistication, special relationship, power, which separates them from the remaining non-human animal kingdom. But is that actually the case, though? There are many groups of humans that are not as cognitively sophisticated, don't have the intellectual capacities, say, for example, babies or cognitively challenged humans. Similarly, we don't share a special relationship with all humans. There might be orphans, or there might be people in like very remote areas. But if there's a disaster or a war, humans are usually in favor of considering their interests, even if you don't share a special relationship with them. Similarly, with power as well, like there are humans who are not as powerful. There are babies, or there are kids, or there are people who are marginalized, who are less powerful than the others. But we do not endorse the idea that it's okay to harm them because they're not powerful. We don't share a special relationship with them. They are not cognitively sophisticated. And so if we are, being consistent, then if we treat animals the way we treat them, and we discriminate against them because they don't have these capacities, then it also makes sense that if humans don't possess these capacities, we can treat them the same way like we treat these animals. But most of us wouldn't endorse that. And so the only way to avoid these repugnant conclusions is by dividing this line, which is to say that these are irrelevant criteria when deciding whom to grant moral consideration to. So what is relevant, I argue, is sentience. Those of you who are not aware of what sentience means, it is the capacity to have positive and negative experiences. There's synonyms for sentience as well, like consciousness, subjective experience, phenomenal consciousness. But this basically refers to the ability for a being to have subjective experience, to have valenced subjective experience, which is positive experiences like joy, pleasure, as well as negative experiences like suffering and pain. And the reason why we avoid harming other humans or say non-humans is because they are negatively affected by it. They have a negative subjective experience like pain or suffering when some negative action is done towards them. A rock, for example, doesn't feel pain or suffering. And so it seems to be that the fundamental factor when we decide not to harm someone is because of this quality of them being sentient. So that is what I argue should be relevant when deciding who to grant moral consideration to. However, this topic of consciousness and sentience is a very hotly contested topic. It's a very fuzzy topic. There's been a lot of research going on. It's not possible to say for sure that this person is conscious and this person is not. There's a lot of factors involved. But that said, we can look at some indicators of sentience. So when trying to identify who is sentient and who is not, we try to deduce based on certain indicators. And there's a variety of indicators for sentience, but broadly, they can be the two prominent ones are physiology, which is the physiological structures that a being has, because to have conscious experience, for example, with humans, we have a nervous system that carries the signals from around the body, and it's processed in a centralized way in our brain, which leads to phenomenal subjective experience. And this is not unique to humans, right? We have a centralized nervous system. We know that without a centralized nervous system, we wouldn't be conscious. Other animals also possess a centralized nervous system. So for example, mammals like cows, they do have a brain and a nervous system. And similarly, pigeons, like birds as well, while it was initially considered that for a being to be conscious, they need to have cortical structures, it was later discovered that birds have subcortical structures that also process experiences the same way, in a homologous way to that of cortical structures. So they still have emotions based on this. So they also do possess a nervous system. Similarly, even some invertebrates like crabs, for example, while they do not have a nervous system, they have a homologous structure, ganglia, which performs the similar functions and leads to similar outcomes. So it need not be that they need to have exactly centralized nervous system like humans, because that would again be anthropocentrism, where we are attributing consciousness or sentience only to the organisms that have things exactly the way we do, but they might have their own way of processing the same functions. And it's been also noticed that invertebrates have nervous systems. Many groups of invertebrates have nervous systems. Some of them have a less complex one, and some of them have a more complex one. But physiology in itself is not a definitive indicator of sentience, right? There are other indicators as well, and there's a wealth of research going on in this area of behavioral science for animals. We all know, I mean, all of you must definitely be aware of the intricate and complex behavior displayed by many groups of non-human animals, whether it's mourning, altruism, care for their young ones among birds, affection, love, protection of their conspecifics. And also, there's been like more research that shows a higher degree of cognitive abilities, like self-awareness in some groups of animals. There is this experiment of a mirror test done among animals to try to understand if they recognize themselves in a mirror, which could be an indicator of self-awareness in animals. And animals, even like cleaner wrasse and zebrafish, have passed the mirror test. Initially, this cleaner wrasse was shown itself in the mirror and it thought that it's another fish and it tried to be aggressive towards it. But then later it started exploring, swimming upside down and trying to explore what this reflection is. And later, when researchers put a small X on the body of the fish, it noticed itself in the reflection and tried to rub it off on the sand, which only goes on to show the amount of like complexity of their minds, the behavior that they show, the intricate behavior that they show. Just because of the alienation that we don't observe them very well, we have discounted the fact that they can show complex behavior as well. And as well as honeybees. Some of you might know, I noticed that there was this talk on bees among the consortium series. So even honeybees, they have showed play behavior, or they've showed behavior where they try to communicate with the rest of the hive by the waggle dance that, oh, the food source is in that way. And they come and direction by spinning a certain number of times, which was demonstrated in a research. So there is definitely growing amount of behavioral evidence as well that many groups of non-human animals are sentient. And there's, again, as I mentioned, there's a wealth of research coming up. Snakes have also passed the mirror test, but in their case, it was not the visuals, but the scent, because as you might know, snakes are more, they're more olfactory than visual. Then bees showing play behavior, and again, categorizing as play behavior where they roll a ball, which is not instrumental for any reasons, but they're just doing it out of an exploratory sense. Crabs always trying to make trade-offs between which shell to choose, or in this particular experiment, there was bright light, but at the same time there were shocks, and crabs had to do cognitive trade-offs between taking shelter against the light or avoiding shocks. Fruit flies having dynamic sleep patterns, and Drosophila are very commonly used for psychological tests, etc., experiments. So yeah, and there's many more research that is coming out to demonstrate incredible behavioral indicators of sentience among animals. Again, it's unlikely or less likely that animals would show all these complex behaviors if they didn't have subjective experience, if they didn't have the capacity to have positive or negative experiences. So combining the physiological and behavioral indicators, it gives us a reason to assume that there's a reasonable chance that these animals are sentient. And there's also growing scientific consensus, the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness in 2012, where a prominent group of cognitive scientists came together and said that humans are not unique in possessing the neuroanatomical features that give rise to conscious experience. All mammals and birds and many groups of invertebrates also possess these structures, these substrates that could lead to consciousness. And more recently, there was the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness as well, which said that there's a realistic possibility that all vertebrates and many invertebrates have sentience, and given that, it'd be irresponsible to ignore them or ignore their interests from the decisions that we make that affects these animals. That said, while there are these scientific declarations coming up, I think you and we all know that within the folk wisdom in India, whether it's the local people, the indigenous tribes, it's never been alien to them that animals are sentient and conscious and are capable of feeling pleasure and pain. They never doubted this. And so there's been a rich history of concern for animals among the people on the ground. But these declarations only help in like a top-down approach, like Nitin mentioned. That said, for India, why is this important? We have like a rich history, like I mentioned, of concern for animals, whether it's from the time of Buddhism, where kings like Ashoka had mandated avoiding animal sacrifices, keeping water for animals, banned killing some animals, etc. And similarly with the indigenous religions like Jains, where the concept of ahimsa was very prevalent. So in many ways, India is a very unique actor within the global space with a lot of these traditional fundamental values that extended moral consideration to animals. And similarly with indigenous tribes, the Bishnoi tribe, the Araku tribe, all of them have the Nilgiris. There has been some sort of like the best word I can come up with is coexistence, where there's an understanding of the experience of these animals and how they could respect them while also like trying to balance the interests of both humans and animals. And we also, at least theoretically, have like quite progressive animal laws that put us in a very unique position to advance the space of animal welfare. Of course, vegetarianism relatively is quite high in India compared to other countries. So that could also play into the advantage that we in India have, which is there is less prevalence of behaviors where they're actively involved in animal exploitation, which makes it more likely that there would be more support for animal protection. However, there is a growing rate of factory farming in many industries that use animals and where they are viewed more in silos and it's like alienated and they are just grown in these factories, in these artificial environments on a huge scale. And this not only increases the scale of animals harmed, but it also increases the severity of harms that animals go through, as I will talk about in the next slides. So to now talk about the situation of animals, I would like to start off with like the anthropogenic harms, and then I will go on to the natural harms. We humans, like I just mentioned, we have been on a growing trend of harming animals at scale with increased severity because we've been thinking about primarily, again, as capitalism and as capitalism has included animals within itself, there has been a growing rate of animal exploitation, whether it's factory farming of broiler hens, where they're growing these containers, or fishes, which are farmed in masse, which are caught in masse from the oceans or farmed. Like right now in India, there's a growing case of factory farming of fishes and shrimps as well. So aquatic farming was not subject to factory farming a couple of decades ago, but now that's all quite rapid. Similarly, if we do them in other ways or in other ways where we separate from their class, we take the products that we want, which leads to a lot of distress and suffering, because harm doesn't only come through death, it also comes through the lived experience, right? So yeah, and those were like the animals that we are using, but then also we harm wild animals for like anthropocentric reasons or human wildlife conflict. For example, hunting kills millions of animals each year. This could be done for entertainment or due to conflicts, for territory, etc. And also sometimes because they are a nuisance or they are considered environmentally like harmful because it harms the species or the ecosystem that we care about. They are killed in quite harmful ways with like, glue traps, which are extremely painful for example, rodents that get stuck onto it and then suffer a lot and die. Similarly, sometimes humans induce diseases into wild animals to control their population. For example, myxotomasis in New Zealand, where they released this infection, viral infection among rabbits, which killed them en masse, which would kill them in 12 days. And it was an extremely painful condition. Again, this was done because they just didn't want these species to exist, and which caused a lot of harm to them. But that said, people usually have this rosy picture of the wild. I mean, people who are out there in the wild know that's not true, but at least the public out there thinks that animals in the wild are living a blissful life and there's no harms as long as humans don't interfere. But is that really the case? As we all know, animals are subject to different forms of natural harms that are not anthropogenic. Usually they're partially anthropogenic because humans have now like almost influenced different environments through climate change, etc., which keeps affecting animals. But there are also natural harms. Say, for example, extreme weather conditions, where these wild asses were in Turkey, they were frozen. They didn't die, but one can only imagine that throughout this cold environment or weather, they might have gone through a lot of agony and distress. Similarly, during droughts, where animals travel long distance for food, and when they don't find it, they die a usually slow and painful death, which not only affects terrestrial animals, but also aquatic animals, where when lakes dry up, all of them end up dying. Um, like I mentioned, diseases are a very prevalent form of suffering in the wild, while farmed, domestic animals, or even some wild animals that we want to conserve, like rhinos, etc., receive care. There are a large portion of wild animals that don't receive medical aid when they are afflicted with diseases. Similarly, disasters in Kaziranga National Park, for example, annual floods, while animals have adapted to moving to the natural highlands, a huge portion of slow-moving animals or the smaller animals, they usually perish, or even if they survive, they go through a lot of harm and get diseases, parasites, etc. And when I talk about wild animals, I'm not just talking about free-living wild animals, but also like animals that are under human influence, the animals, which, like for example, snakes, pigeons, crows, rats, etc. So there are also harms that these urban wild animals go through in the urban environment or in the agricultural environment, where, like for example, with high-rise buildings, birds usually collide with them because they're unable to distinguish with these glass buildings. They usually collide with them and they perish. So there's also harms in the urban settings for wild animals. Of course, there's more natural forms of suffering as well, where there is conflicts for territory, mate, and other reasons. And another reason, I'm sure most of you must know, but another reason to suspect that the negative experiences are quite prevalent in the wild is because of the reproductive strategy, where a large portion of smaller animals give birth to a huge number of offsprings. And because of the reproductive strategy, they give low parental care and high number of offsprings, out of which very few of them end up surviving to adulthood. So there's a high juvenile mortality, and most of them end up dying due to parasites, predation, diseases, etc. Like, for example, with turtles, it's some estimates say that from around 1,000 babies, only 1 or 2 end up surviving to adulthood, and most of them end up dying quite soon after they come into existence. Similarly, with other invertebrates, like for example, bullfrogs, on average, they give birth to around 10,000 offsprings, out of which very few end up surviving. And like sometimes when the lake dries, all of the tadpoles, and to the extent that tadpoles are sentient, we don't know. But if they are sentient, then all of them would have like quite a short life and not a lot of experience, not a lot of opportunity to have positive experiences, and they usually just suffer and then die. And then similarly with butterflies as well, from a clutch of 600, it's estimated that less than 10% make it to adulthood. Again, this is for the balance in the ecosystem, where they have adapted to giving birth to a huge number of offsprings, where very few of them end up surviving. Whereas some other species like elephants, humans, or orangutans, they give birth to a fewer number of offsprings and give a lot of parental care. The point being that given the reproductive strategy that is prevalent in the wild, it is likely that a lot of animals that come into existence live a short life, and they have a lot of opportunity to have positive experiences. So yeah, that was a short outline of the problem that I wanted to communicate, which is how animals are, what the situation of animals is, both that are harmed due to anthropogenic harms and due to natural harms. That said, one might feel pessimistic because ecosystems are very complex, and this is how it is, and if we intervene, we might make things worse. And so there's a lot of hesitations about doing something about these forms of harms. But that said, there are things that can be done, and I would like to show some potential opportunities for us to make change. There are interventions where humans are caring about wild animals, at least some wild animals, say, for example, elephants, building rehabilitation centers where orphaned animals are cared for. while it is partially for conservationist interests or anthropocentric interests, does end up aiding animals as well. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been tribes, like indigenous tribes, since like many centuries caring for wild animals, say with Bishnoi tribes or with other cultures as well. Like India is like such a diverse spot, and there's a lot of wealth in the indigenous knowledge on how to, like, recently someone mentioned that Tamil Nadu government has this in their constitution that all living beings should have right to access water, and water should be provided to all of them. And so this form of inclusiveness for the well-being of wild animals is quite prevalent, and it's not as alien as it is in the Western countries. There have been like programs done when there has been drought, for example, in the Bishnoi community, as well as during disasters. There have been people who've gone out there and helped animals, provided them with aid, and haven't left them because it's a natural disaster. So why should we interfere? Whereas they were more open to helping animals in these cases. When animals get disoriented during the tides and they get stuck on the shores, the community comes together to take them back into the oceans. So there have been like interventions done to help animals and to care for them, to consider their well-being, even though it's not been done on the scale as it should have. But all this said, I want to recognize the uncertainties here. As a lot of us must be thinking right now, there are a lot of unknown unknowns. How do we help animals without ensuring it causes additional harm to some other species? How do we take into account the intricate dynamic relationships that exist out there in the wild? How much suffering is good suffering? What makes a life of an animal meaningful? Is it better for this animal to not come into existence or to come into existence, suffer and die? So there are a lot of epistemic and practical issues that come up. And this, like, as I mentioned, I'm an ethicist, I'm providing my perspective, but to actually implement it, it requires a lot of scientific understanding, a lot of pragmatic understanding on the effects of it and responsible ways of improving the well-being of animals in the wild. And hence, the organization I work with and a few other organizations are proposing a new field of study called as welfare biology or wild animal welfare science. This is analogous to animal welfare science, which cares about animals that are used by humans, like it considers the welfare of animals used by humans, whereas welfare biology will look at the welfare of animals that are living out there in the wild. Here, I'm not considering wild animals that are in human captivity, but animals that are outside human control. And this, imagine, cross-disciplinary field, because there is already a lot of knowledge that is possessed by different domains of subjects, which is like zoology. There's a lot of information there, ecology. There's a lot of research that's done in understanding the dynamic relationships that exist out there in the wild. So by utilizing this information and trying to integrate it and find ways of helping animals from their welfare point of view, from the information that we have there, will allow us to find ways of improving the welfare of animals in the wild. And there have been interventions that are done on a larger scale as well, even though they were done partially for anthropocentric reasons. Say, for example, with rhinos, where there were artificial highlands built in Kaziranga National Park, where while it was primarily built for the larger animals, a lot of smaller animals also benefited from interventions, and it did help them. And I heard that the government was planting like food trees and food crops and was sending vets onto these highlands to provide aid to these animals when they were escaping the floodwaters. And to understand better on what the attitudes of scientists are in helping animals out there in the wild, we conducted a study at Animal Ethics where we interviewed 337 participants, both scholars and students, especially from the life sciences background. And this was done in multiple countries. Unfortunately, India wasn't included, but hopefully in the next survey, we can also understand the attitudes that people or scholars here have. And we found that they are in favor of helping animals out there in the wild, but in some circumstances. So these three were the lines of research and action that they most supported. The first mode of intervention was vaccinating animals, probably because of zoonotic diseases becoming prevalent in the recent times. There was less resistance to helping animals through vaccination, which would in the end also benefit humans as well as farmed animals. And then helping urban wild animals, given that they are not out there in the wild, there seems to be less resistance to helping animals that are already influenced by humans in some ways. And then there was also interest in helping animals during weather events. Again, this is also probably because we have influenced climate to such an extent where a lot of weather events can be partially attributed to human activities, and hence, more support to helping animals during weather events like floods or forest fires. And there can also be a lot of work done from an urban wildlife point of view, where we can come up with policies and try to understand how land use affects wild animal welfare, and coming up with potential policies that is positive both for humans as well as non-human animals. And another example of this is also like fertility control. As you all know, man-animal conflict is, I find the name a little bit confusing sometimes, man-animal, or I could say human-animal, wild-animal conflict, or just animal conflict, where animals are usually culled because they are not considered, or they are not, their interests are not taken seriously, whereas they can be more compassionate ways of solving the problem, maybe through the field of compassionate conservation, where there are more humane ways of population control, like contraceptives that were used in, for example, in this case in Barcelona. But I'm also aware that immunocontracceptives are being experimented with in India as well, with elephants, for example, and it causes less stress. However, more research needs to be done on how it is scalable and can be implemented more widely. It's also being done in Oak Bay, for example, with deers. And also vaccination of animals can be done as well in Marseille. Like this has already been done in many situations where the vaccine was put into the cookies and dropped from helicopter in many areas of Northern America, and now huge regions of North America are free from rabies because of interventions like this. What else can be done? I'm aware that I'm probably over time, so I'm going to skip a few slides, and hence I'm going a little fast. Pardon me for that. So to account for this, we have been advocating for more research, more scientific research to go into this area to understand how we can responsibly help animals in the wild at scale. Doing more outreach. Like a few years ago, this idea of helping wild animals, at least in the academic space and the advocacy space, was considered very alien, and there was a lot of resistance, but that's slowly changing. People are now becoming more open to helping animals in the wild. Outreach definitely plays an important role in spreading this idea that the well-being of animals in the wild matters. So yeah, that can have a crucial change as well. And of course, lobbying, coming up with policies that improve wild animal welfare, and of course, running pilot experiments. None of these interventions can be immediately implemented. There need to be pilots done, understanding, preferably pilots which are reversible, and where if we understand that, oh, this form of intervention is causing harm, then we can potentially reverse these interventions as well. And then, of course, funding. Like you all know, like this is such a niche space, and there's not a lot of conversation gone into it. And so, there is very little funding available in this domain as well. So more fundraising will definitely help. These are some organizations that have been working on this topic so far. There's Animal Ethics, the organization I work with. Wild Animal Initiative has been doing more academic research and academic field building to promote more research on wild animal welfare. There's Rethink Priorities and NYU Wild Animal Welfare. A little bit about the organization I work with. We are primarily an education organization, we try to educate the public, the relevant stakeholders about the topics that I spoke about ethics, sentience, wild animal suffering, and how humans exploit animals. We have also translated our website into 12 different languages, including Hindi and Telugu. And so if you're interested in learning about this, I would highly recommend checking out the website. We've also published a video course on wild animal suffering, which is available on Animal Ethics YouTube channel, where you can learn about these topics in more depth. We have also released an ebook on Introduction to Wild Animal Suffering, a guide to the issues. I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in learning about the arguments and nuances of this thing. And if you're interested in engaging with this through LLMs, I would recommend checking out this LLM that we released called Senti. And so you can engage with this topic through this LLM and more time. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Aditya. That was a very interesting talk and gave us so much to think about. And I'm sure that everyone has a lot of questions for you. So let's open up the talk. And if anyone has any questions, they can raise their hands and just ask them. I believe Rana has a question.
Yep. Hi, Aditya. Thank you for your talk. I, of course, have several comments to make. So what I'll do is I will just make one or two. These are questions rather than comments, and then I will stop because otherwise it can just go on, and I'll come back and ask my other questions once once I get a chance again to do that, right? And the first and the two most important comments that I have. The first is, can science ever establish sentience in other beings? I know you hinted at it, you talked about it, but I would argue that I'm not able to even determine sentience in other humans unless they actively tell me, which therefore depends on linguistic communication, for them to tell me whether they are feeling pain or not. So if there's a deaf-mute individual or someone who I cannot interact with otherwise, but can I watch from a distance, my argument here is that no amount of behavioral understanding of this other individual will establish sentience, right? We may have very good guesses at correlations, but they continue to remain correlations. I don't think we will ever be able to causally establish sentience in other beings. Now, I know I'm taking a very hardline stand, but as a hardcore scientist, a natural scientist trained in Western methodologies, I really don't think there's any way I can be convinced that I'll be able to establish sentience in other beings. That's my first comment. And my second comment, which is again a very broad comment, is that I would argue that no human activity that impinges on non-humans is ever beneficial, right? Leave aside beneficial, none of them are even neutral, right? So I would argue, therefore, that if I followed an animal so-called non-invasively with a pair of binoculars for the next 3 years, because I'm doing a behavioral study on them, this is as invasive as it can get. And one way of deciphering this is to ask ourselves, would we like someone with a pair of binoculars following us every minute of our lives for the next 3 years, right? And then if you're saying, no, we won't like it, but the animals might like it, clearly we have no way of knowing whether they like it. But I would argue that it's as much a disturbance because there are long-term repercussions of me following animals, so-called non-invasively with binoculars, that I will not go back, that I will not revisit once my study is done. And another example, this is of course an academic question, but the other one is of conservation. All the conservation activities that we do, I think we are very hard-pressed to establish even a single behavioral activity of humans aimed at conservation, which is not harmful for the animals. Like take captive breeding. Do we have the right to take the last 6 individuals of a population and put them under captive breeding, right? So So I think, therefore, that conservation, and I'm again going out on a limb to say this, that conservation is essentially a human activity which takes into account human sensitivities and is meant, in the large part, for human benefits. And it has absolutely nothing to do with non-humans at all, though we think that we are doing a great benefit to them by conserving them. Yeah, sorry. You can, if you don't have time now, you don't have to respond to them, but I think these are issues that all of us should debate about. Yeah, thanks very much once again.
Thank you, Anindya, for your inputs. Yeah, I find them very interesting. I have a quick few reflections on them, and I can share them. I'm not sure if we will be able to have we'll have sufficient time to have like a proper discussion on this. But I think with regards to sentience, I agree that it's not possible for us to know 100%, even with like the best technologies out there, that this particular being is sentient. But do we require 100% certainty of their sentience to be able to, care about their interests and try to help them when possible? Like even if I have like 40 or 50% probability that this pig is sentient or this dog is sentient, isn't that like sufficient for us to take a precautionary approach to avoiding harming them? Because in the case that they are sentient, then the amount of harm that they would go through would be a lot. And so from that perspective, it might make sense to avoid harming them, even if they are not even if you're not sure 100% that they are sentient. Sure, people might have like subjective thresholds on like, oh, I require 80% threshold of sentience. Only then I will take their interest into consideration. But like I mentioned in my slide, there's a growing body of evidence that shows that there are reasons to assume that a large group of animals are sentient. Again, there are indicators, there are evidence, but again, we don't have conclusive evidence in any case. Even with another human, I might not know for sure that they are sentient, but I deduce based on their behavior, based on just how I function, it's likely that they function in similar ways in terms of suffering and pleasure. So that's like my understanding of this topic, which is we don't need 100% certainty to try to help these beings or avoid harming them. So that's one. And in terms of like, like no amount of like any action would be harmful, not even neutral. Regarding that point, I am not sure if I buy into the fact that all interventions that humans do are net harmful for animals. But that said, I recognize that we have a reputation of whenever we interfere, the forms of interference that we do are usually harmful. But then I can definitely imagine situations where it might be net positive for these animals. And there's a lot of uncertainty here. Of course, I acknowledge that. And hence, I advocate for more research and more knowledge before we actually pursue these interventions. Like, for example, in forest fires, when an animal is burning to death, I find it hard to imagine how helping that animal from that extreme, excruciating situation might be net negative for that animal. So I can definitely imagine other such situations as well.
Just a quick point here, just again to think about, not for you to respond necessarily. Sometimes I think death may be better than captivity, maybe less harmful to an animal than captivity, because captivity is long-term suffering. Just again, something to think about.
Yeah, thanks. I can see how that would make sense. Like there might be situations like for humans where we would prefer death over extreme suffering. And so I can see how that's possible. So in some cases, non-existence might be preferable to negative welfare. And I think the last one, which you said, is conservation being primarily anthropocentric and it's not meant for other things. Yes, I think, I mean, I'm not well informed enough to comment on that, on the origins of conservation as a science. But then that said, I do see some changes happening, like, for example, with compassionate conservation, where there are some conservationists who are interested in finding less harmful ways of protecting ecosystems, or species, or biodiversity, which takes into account the harms that animals go through. So it might or might not be the case, but what I'm in favor of is conservationists who care about animal well-being, taking this into account in their lines of research and in the interventions that they pursue. I'm not trying to make a claim for conservation as a whole. Yeah. Thanks for the questions. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
I have some more comments, but I can say that I can ask them once others have had a chance to do it.
Why don't you ask one more question while we wait for other people to...
Okay, all right. My second question is, when we look at vegetarianism, sure, I agree that by definition, vegetarianism is not affecting animals, at least in terms of eating them. But I don't think there is any correlation that has ever been shown between having a vegetarian mindset versus not being cruel, however you may define it, to animals. So it sometimes becomes an argument that people push for animal welfare in general, but I think it's rather limited in scope. And in fact, the counter argument to that, as you said, Aditya, is that many of our so-called indigenous communities have perhaps greater sense of welfare for animals, but yet many of them practice hunting for sport, which I think can be justified simply because they enjoy doing it. And why, in that case, should we prevent people from enjoying themselves at the cost of animals? Why are animals more important than people? So that's a very important philosophical debate. But I don't have an answer. There's no objective answer to this, clearly. That's one point. Second point is, what about plants? Right? So I'm sure you know of this recent paper which shows that when a plant stem is cut or when plants are wilting because of lack of water, they emit very high-pitched, human inaudible sounds, right? So then are we justified in killing plants? Isn't that speciesism when we think that we can't harm animals, but we can harm plants, right? I think that philosophically is an indefensible position, right? So then you're being speciesist of a certain kind. That's the point. And my final point is, of course, I think this is important to think about, is the difference between welfare and well-being. When you think you're doing good to an animal, that's welfare, right? You think this is good for the animal. But the actual story of what is good for that animal must come from the animal herself or itself or themselves, right? Because only they will be able to report to us whether they are feeling good, right? And so there's so much of assumptions that are going in that I don't find any way in which I can defend any of the arguments that are typically made. And so I think I have two solutions for this. The first is, each of us needs to decide what is the best way we are going to engage with other beings, human or non-human, without making any kind of assumptions about why we are doing. We can, of course, try and explore how our interactions with them can have effects, both beneficial and costly, to both us and to the other beings that we are interacting with. But the final decision is really each individual's, because everyone has a different idea of how they would like to pursue welfare and take into account the well-being of other individuals, right? So that's one thing that I would like to strongly suggest for. And the other thing I would again like to think is, so we have two ends, right? One is where we are doing various things to try and make their lives better, what we call welfare. And the other is to just not involve oneself at all and minimize the kind of interactions we have with other beings. And in this case, let's say non-human beings. And that may also be a particular strategy where not doing anything may be considered better than doing something, because we are not really sure what the effects of doing is, unless we assume, as you pointed out, that we think it's for their good, right? So why is 40% being sentient better or worse than someone being 10% sentient or not being sentient, right? So it really depends on my philosophy whether I want to hurt a non-sentient being or a sentient being. It doesn't matter whether that being is sentient or not. And that's, I think, what Jainism does. I think Jainism clearly recognizes the superiority of humans over other forms of life, but on the basis of certain arguments, but takes into account the fact, or suggests, that it's the right of every individual to protect and take care of individuals who are below them in the hierarchy. So they do recognize a hierarchy, but they also give announcements of how we should protect other beings who are who are not in as advantageous as a position as we are innately. It's not because of what we have done, but they are innately inferior to us, but we need to protect them. So there are these nuances, and I think it's remarkable that we have been able to come up with these kind of prescriptions. But ultimately, I think it depends on how each of us look at our relationship and interactions with other beings. Yeah. Sorry, spoken a lot.
Thank you. No, that was all very interesting input. Thank you. Again, I don't think I can exhaustively address all the points that you made. Again, I can only share my reflections. Maybe starting off with plant sentience. Yes, that's usually like there are isolated studies that come out which talk about, oh, plants emit this frequency, or that like when there are certain sounds, these plants flourish, and when there's like noise played, they don't. Though like there has been hesitation, like there have been no peer-reviewed studies that kind of conclusively claim that plants are sentient. And I argue that science is usually more conservative in attributing sentience to any being apart from human than not. And so the fact that there was Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness or New York Declaration of Consciousness, I think already meets a certain bar of sentience that they're claiming that, oh, all mammals and birds are sentient. And so if we are following expert evidence, again, you might be skeptical of like the Western scientific approach, and you might not give it sufficient credibility when they make claims. But the fact that they are claiming that they're sentient, I think, counts for something. And that is that. With plants, again, behavior is one indicator, which they might be hormonal changes, or they might be like some changes in the physical structure of the plant with certain stimuli. But does that in itself constitute phenomenal experience? Are they having a subjective experience? Do they have the physiological structures to facilitate conscious experience? So I think these are all questions that need to be engaged with. And of course, like you mentioned, there is precautionary principle and there's incautionary principle. You cannot assume that everything is conscious or sentient and then like act like everything gets hurt. You require at least a certain degree of evidence before which you start considering the interests of that being. So maybe plants don't satisfy that bar yet, and there's not enough evidence for them to be sentient. So that is one thing. And I think regarding cluelessness of like what is good for animals and what is not, I think humans constantly make decisions, even when there is cluelessness and uncertainty, based on the best knowledge that we have. If it turns out that us not engaging in a certain ecosystem is the best from their welfare point of view, then yeah, that makes sense. But even to reach that conclusion, maybe it's important to disrupt the status quo of like that being the best solution. Whereas we need to do more research to understand, is the best option to not do anything? Because us not doing something would also lead to harm. So irrespective of our intervention, what's the harm? Like, what's the counterfactual? If we interfere, what's the net harm there? And if we don't, what's the net harm? So I think there are different considerations to take into account, and it requires a proper assessment before we come to the conclusion that, oh, in this case, not interfering is the best option. Like you said, it's possible that in captivity, animals might suffer more than if they don't exist. So I think it requires a more systematic understanding. And with regards to the preference of animals, I think like as seen in animal welfare science or in the field of ethology, there have already been a lot of experiments done to understand the preference of animals, how they make trade-offs, what would they prefer given these circumstances. That's been done for rats, for other animals. And like we already know a lot about companion animals like dogs and cats through this field of animal welfare science. So there's definitely a lot of scope to try to understand what the preferences of animals are and to not let this uncertainty disable us from trying to help them. And so what I advocate for is, instead of saying, oh, because I don't know, I'm not going to do anything, I'm claiming that let's try to gain more information so we can help them. And in cases where there is already a lot of information, let's help them. And I don't have a lot of comments regarding Jainism per se. But I guess, again, I'm not going to subscribe to this idea that we are in hierarchy. What I'm subscribing here is equal consideration of equal interests. If a being has higher interests in not dying compared to our interest in like using them for some purpose, then in this case, I would recommend taking their interest more seriously, which has more weight. I'm not sure I can convince you with these, or like even persuade you with these
So
short
let me
arguments, but
just
they were
say,
just
sorry,
yeah.
sorry, I'll just say one line. I know Vinay has his hand up, but let me just say one line. I think what we are confusing here or conflating here is facts versus your value systems. And there are no facts. That's the problem. The problem is you can never convince anyone about sentience, number one, even scientifically. And number two, more importantly, how we behave towards another individual is just how we value it. It has nothing to do with what I know about it. And we can never, ever have an objective definition of sentience across individuals. Forget about across species. You can tolerate a lot more pain than I can. You may even enjoy being hurt. You may actually enjoy being in pain. So who am I to decide what you should do? I can only go by what you tell me, number one, or what I personally believe I should be doing. That's it. No amount of facts or science can ever establish these, is my argument. Sorry, I'll really stop now. But thank you very much.
Vinay, would you like to share your thoughts? I'm sorry, if I go into the responding part again, I imagine there to be like a longer chain, but I'm happy to engage offline if possible.
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, Aditya. Thanks for the session. Thanks for all that you shared. Rana Anna briefly, the last point which Rana Anna raised, briefly touched the question which I wanted to ask, whether it's ethics or a policy, it invites some kind of standardization. And people across India, you already mentioned, like there is very diverse communities across India, and like there are these animals with which they interact, and it's like changes from place to place. So when you bring these standardizations for people to behave certain way to with the animals or interact in a certain way with these animals, similarly across all the communities, all the like that standardization, I'm expecting inviting lots of turbulence, or like invites lots of questions. Again, I think, I don't know whether my question made some sense.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Vinay. I think it did make sense. And I'm sorry if the way I described things made it imply that I am asking for standardization. I am not. I'm asking for more reflection on how we ought to take this situation to while making decisions that affect animals, as opposed to saying that, oh, this is the line of code that we must all follow. However, there have been some things that have been accepted socially or in a given academic discipline, like the ethic of it. Like, for example, racism is eschewed or sexism is eschewed. At some point, they were quite prevalent. Of course, even back then, it was subjective. Maybe some people were against like these forms of prejudices, whereas the others were more open to it. But then there was a slow moving consensus, and that's how social change happens. I also imagine within an academic discipline, there is change in the paradigms that are used. So I am advocating for this paradigm to also be given representation. I don't think everyone would be like bought onto this, but given that right now there is very little work happening from the wild animal welfare point of view, from an anti-speciesist point of view, what I'm advocating for is for more work to happen from this perspective as well, as opposed to completely ignoring it. It's very far off where I'm claiming that this needs to be the standard, but what I'm arguing for is there needs to be more line of research from this paradigm, where the well-being of wild animals is also considered. Did that make sense?
Yeah, to some extent, but yeah.
Yeah, and just to add on, I don't think I am asking to override the knowledge that's present among the indigenous tribes in different cultures, etc. But as I said, I'm only arguing from my perspective, from these lines of arguments, and then how that intersects and interfaces with the reality in different cultures is a thing that also needs to be studied and navigated around. Maybe it's possible that in some regions in Karnataka, this intervention would be the most supported one, whereas in Assam, helping animals during floods would be the most supported one. So I think like there's a lot of potential for exploration, how best to implement them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering these questions, and I'm sure that there's a lot more room for debate and discussion because this topic is so broad and there's so many thoughts. So many people have so many thoughts about this. But yeah, I think we can end it right now because it has already gone way past time. But thank you so much for this talk, Aditya. It was very interesting, and thank you everyone for attending this talk. And we'll catch you during the next coexistence in practice talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.